Ladies and gentlemen, we now embark on a semester-long exciting journey where we'll explore how societies operate and how various social structures influence human actions. Our first module is called What Do Sociologists Study? And we start with Chapter 1, Understanding Sociology. Here we'll focus on the fundamentals, so it's important that you have good understanding of the material covered in this chapter. What you learn here will need to be applied in almost all consecutive chapters. So first we'll briefly talk about what sociological theory is, what it explains, and what it consists of. We'll compare common sense statements about our society with actual sociological research findings. And we'll see how to use sociological imagination to identify the cause of a social problem within our society, rather than simply attributing that cause to individual personality traits. Most of this lecture, however, will be dedicated to the founders of sociology. We'll talk about Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim, and the major theoretical perspectives that sociologists use today, such as the functionalist perspective, the conflict perspective, and social interactionist perspective. Let's begin our first lecture. What is sociology? Sociological theory. Before we define sociological theory, I'd like to make sure that the words we're using here are clearly understood and not confusing. Such words as theory, perspective, or paradigm are used interchangeably as synonyms. Do we know what they mean? What's a theory? What is it for? What does it do? Theory, or perspective, or paradigm means explanation of the reality. A theory explains what happens in our natural or social environment, why it happens, and how it happens. For instance, the theory of relativity explains how time and space are relative. The supply and demand theory explains why commodity price can go up and down. The theory of evolution explains the origin of different species. And the theory of psychoanalysis explains the role of early childhood experiences and unconscious impulses in someone's behavior. Next, each theory consists of principles, or we could also call them concepts, ideas, notions, or models. It's a reflection of the reality. It's a mental image we use in our thinking. So think about the concept of money, principle of natural selection, the notion of psychological defense mechanisms, or the model for time travel. Finally, scientists always come up with special words they use to describe their theories, or terminology. Partial economic equilibrium, mimicry, transference, gravitational waves, and so forth. A sociological theory, then, is a set of principles and definitions that seek to explain how societies operate and how people relate to one another and respond to their surroundings. In the second half of this lecture, you will learn some sociological theories and principles, and will need to memorize some definitions. What is sociology? Sociology versus common sense. Do we need common sense? Although some people lack common sense, I'd hope that most of us have it and use it frequently. Common sense is our ability to make prudent decisions based on our perception of the surrounding world. So if it's cold outside, wear a jacket. If you don't have enough money, don't buy a new car. If you feel sick, go see a doctor. If you gave your children a bath, towel dry them and don't put them in the dryer. Common sense works well in simple situations like these, but in more complex situations, not so much. Before we had astronomy, our common sense told us the Earth was flat. Before we had microbiology, we thought all diseases could be cured by bloodletting. And before the Wright brothers, our common sense told us only birds could fly. So you know that you couldn't build a working rocket based on common sense only. But could you explain human behavior using just common sense? Let's take a look at some common sense statements about our society and see if empirical evidence collected by sociologists supports them or not. First statement. The poor break the law more often than the rich. True or false? Well, we do see a lot more poor people in prisons, and on TV they always seem to talk about some burglars, robbers, drug addicts, alcoholics, and scammers who are after your hard-earned money. So it must be true. False. The poor are not more criminal than the wealthy. I'd even say it the other way around. The poor just get prosecuted much more often because they don't have the money and power the rich have. There's even this very common practice in criminal justice called plea bargaining, where the defendants, because they can't afford good attorneys, plead guilty in order to avoid a very harsh sentence, even though they may be completely innocent. On the other hand, we've got white-collar and corporate crimes that are rarely prosecuted. While so many politicians commit unethical and criminal actions that result in suffering and sometimes even death of millions of people, when does they go to prison? How often does a corporate CEO go to prison for their illegal actions? 2. The United States is a middle-class society with most people more or less equal. True or false? This should be true because they always say that our democracy is based on middle-class Americans, and pretty much everybody who is willing to work can earn middle-class income. False. While the United States used to be a middle-class nation, today it's extremely polarized. Today, the top 1% of Americans own almost half of the nation's wealth. Today, a CEO of a major company, by the time he is done sipping his morning coffee, has earned more money than an average company employee earns in a year. Imagine that, $50,000 an hour, while according to the IRS statistics, 70% of Americans earn less than $50,000 a year. At the time when millions of Americans go bankrupt, every year the Forbes magazine adds several hundred people to their list of billionaires. Yes, the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. Number 3. Most poor people ignore opportunities to work. True or false? Well, Walmart or McDonald's are always hiring, so this one has to be true. False. This is false for 2 reasons. First of all, the majority of those who live in poverty are either children or elderly. They don't ignore opportunities to work. They simply can't work, yet or anymore. Second of all, yes, it's not that hard to find a minimum wage job, but will it get you out of poverty? There's a famous social experiment conducted by Barbara Ehrenreich, which she describes in her book Nickel and Dimed on not getting by in America. I can highly recommend this book. A best-selling author, for her next book she decides to travel across the United States and experience what it's like to live on a minimum wage. She goes to different states and takes minimum wage jobs such as waitress, maid, housekeeper, dietary aide, and sales associate. The last leg of her trip was in Minneapolis, by the way. Her conclusion? If you intend to live indoors, you'd better have at least 2 minimum wage jobs. So basically working from 8 a.m. till midnight, including weekends. Well, let's double check this. Let's do our own calculations. Suppose you have a minimum wage job that pays $8 an hour. That means that after all taxes and deductions, your monthly budget is about $1,000. So, monthly budget is $1,000, which we cannot exceed. Now tell me, in this area, what would be the cheapest apartment you can find? Rent. I think the cheapest you can find is about $500. Next, we have utilities. And that's your gas, electricity, your water and sewer bill, garbage removal. So this is about $200 a month. Next we have internet, TV, and phone service. These are landline or cell phone. And that's at least $100. Car insurance, car maintenance, insurance, and maintenance. That's about $100. Gas. That's currently about $150 a month. Medical insurance, deductibles, co-payments. Medical insurance. Deductibles and payments. That's gonna cost you about $300 a month if you're lucky, if you don't have a pre-existing condition. You have to eat, don't you? Groceries. We'll give you $200 a month. Household and personal items. And personal items, $50. And that brings our total to $1,600. So these are just bare bone necessities. We use the lowest prices possible in the best case scenario where there are no emergencies of any kind, and still it's clear that one cannot survive on the minimum wage. And what if you have a family and dependents to support? What about your retirement savings? What if you get sick or your car breaks down? Will you have any savings? According to the 2011 study from the National Foundation for Credit Counseling, 64% of Americans didn't have enough savings to handle a $1,000 emergency expense. It's very sad. Okay, it's getting too depressing. Enough of that. Let's talk about love. Most people marry because they fall in love. Yes, that's how marriage works in America. False. Why is it false? Well, it turns out that love is not a spontaneous emotion, but rather a sort of premeditated action. Before we allow ourselves to fall in love with someone, we sift potential mates through a number of cultural, sociological, and psychological filters. Consciously or subconsciously, we make sure that the future spouse is of suitable race, ethnicity, religion, social class, age, educational background, income level, etc. To most people, it's inconceivable that you could fall in love with and marry your grandpa or first cousin, right? This filter is called the rule of exogamy. Even though nowadays Americans accept interracial marriages, Not that many Americans actually have interracial marriages. Only 7% do according to the 2010 census. So that's how sociologists dissect love. And the last one, differences in the social behavior of females and males are human nature. True or false? Okay, at least one of those common sense statements has to be true. False again. There are some minor natural differences between males and females, but most of the differences we see are learned from society. Is it fair to say that all females are naturally interested in cooking and changing diapers, while all males are naturally interested in race cars and football? Of course not. Before we are even born, our parents have already selected gender-appropriate colors for the nursery, gender-appropriate toys, and gender-appropriate clothes. To reinforce this point even further, there are some societies where boys are raised to be feminine. What is sociology? Sociological imagination. Sociological imagination is the ability to see the connection between individual actions and the wider society. This is what I would ultimately like you to demonstrate in this class. Using sociological imagination, we can attempt to solve our social problems. Typically, we attribute the cause of a problem to the individual and unfortunately resort to some pretty pejorative words. Well, of course certain people are lazy and irresponsible, and the predicament they're in is their fault. But on a larger scale, we have to analyze the social structure of our society in order to understand why certain problems happen and how to solve them. Punishing certain individuals and making certain things illegal solves nothing. Let's outlaw sub-zero temperatures in Wisconsin. Nice idea, but will it work? Did prohibition in the United States work? Do speed limit signs work? We'll achieve much better results if we study our society and make international comparisons too. Why is it that the United States has the highest abortion rate among all developed nations? If American women had the same maternity benefits as European women, up to 3 years of paid maternity leave instead of being fired by your boss, maybe the number of abortions would decrease here as well. Considering that about half of those women who have abortions already had one in the past, perhaps our sex education system doesn't work very well. If multinational corporations continue to outsource while driving local employers out of business, where will the jobs come from? How can we expect our struggling economy to improve? If Mexicans are forced to work at those factories known as maquiladoras along the US-Mexico border for $20 a week, it would be a miracle if they didn't choose to cross the border. I know I would for the sake of my family. Yes, but why don't they come here legally? It's because currently there isn't a legal way to immigrate here other than through marriage, by applying for political asylum or refugee status, or when a major employer such as Microsoft, for example, petitions the government to let them bring some highly skilled software developers from India. If I wanted to invite and legally employ a nanny from Mexico, I wouldn't be allowed to do so. I myself, when I still lived in Ukraine, tried applying for a tourist visa just to come visit the United States and was denied. Well, anyway, what I want you to remember is that whenever there is a large spread, systemic, and long-lasting issue, always try to locate the root cause within our society. If one of you gets an F in my class, while others are on A's and B's, it's safe to say that it's that individual's fault. If most of you fail my class, are you to blame? Or is there something wrong with the class and the instructor who designed it? Part 2. History of Sociology. Founders of Sociology. Here we'll talk about Auguste Comte. You can see what his full name was, who is considered the godfather of sociology, and the founding fathers of sociology, Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, and Max Weber. Both Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim were French, while Karl Marx and Max Weber were German. 2 French and 2 German. Easy to remember. Auguste Comte was a prominent philosopher who developed a theory called positivism, and may be considered one of the first true modern scientists. According to his theory, the only useful information comes from sensory experiences and mathematical processing of such empirical data. To better understand what this means, let's take a look at his view of human history. During the first stage, theological or fictitious, people possessed no real knowledge of their environment, as absolutely everything was explained through the will of different gods. There was a deity for everything: the sun, wind, thunder, rain, sea, memory, love, death, hunting, winemaking, etc. So no real effort to explain the laws of nature and society. In the second stage, metaphysical or abstract, people do try to interpret the world around them, but rely solely on their logic and imagination. In other words, they just make everything up. Medieval scholars had absolutely no desire to do any research and would entertain themselves by engaging in lengthy debates on the topic of how many teeth a horse had. No one bothered to go open its mouth and count. And so the positive stage, or scientific, is where research is done to explain natural and social laws. Seems like a no-brainer to us, but it took humanity hundreds of years to realize this. Next, Auguste Comte named what he considered the 6 positive sciences: mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and at the very top he placed sociology, which he called the Queen of Sciences. When I interviewed for this teaching position at WITC, as part of the interview process, I had to write a short essay and in about 20 minutes explain to my potential students why sociology was important. I quoted Auguste Comte. So it's a Queen of Sciences because it studies how to better our society and live in harmony with our fellow human beings. Sociology, according to Comte, should consist of social statics. This part focuses on various social structures in society. And social dynamics. This part focuses on social processes. Please note that Auguste Comte is called the godfather of sociology for a reason. Although he had all the right ideas about this new science, he never applied them because the French society was not ready for it yet. It was not complex enough. So he is not one of the founding fathers of sociology. This is very similar to how philosophers in ancient Greece believed that everything consisted of atoms, but of course there was no technology at that time to test their hypothesis. Yes, the French experienced different revolutions and major upheavals in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but their society was still a traditional agrarian society with a simple structure. It took a different kind of revolution that forever changed our lives from this to this: the Industrial Revolution. Traditional close-knit communities where everybody knew everybody gave way to urban areas where everything was impersonal. Large families were dissolving, and children, instead of working on family farms, were now moving away from their parents and working at factories. Manual labor was replaced with mechanized labor, and mass production appeared. Life in large cities was full of social problems: orphans, prostitutes, crippled factory workers dying in the streets, lack of sanitation, tuberculosis, venereal diseases, child labor, beggars, extreme wealth along with extreme poverty, and nobody seemed to care. These unprecedented changes were so rapid and so dramatic that the American writer Upton Sinclair referred to this society as the jungle. It is under these conditions that sociology really developed as an attempt to provide some answers and fixes to the social problems created by the Industrial Revolution. So remember, sociology specifically studies modern, industrialized societies, while social anthropology studies traditional societies. Now let's learn about the founders of sociology. We'll go in chronological order. First is the author of this famous line: "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." Who wrote this? The scary Karl Marx did. Would you like to live in a socialist or communist society as described by Marx? Wait, don't give me your answer yet. Decades of anti-Marxist conditioning, I'm sure, resulted in real aversion to this name. And just to let you know, Karl Marx spent much of his adult life in exile, moving from one country to another to avoid government persecution. All European governments hated him. Nobody wanted to give him a job, and he lived in extreme poverty, surviving on some honoraria for publishing papers here and there, and on the money borrowed from his friend Friedrich Engels. So why is it that his persona has been so despised and feared by Western governments and the wealthy, while at the same time considered one of the greatest minds in our history? On the list of the 100 most influential Jews of all time, he is in the top 10 along with Jesus Christ, Moses, Einstein, and Freud. So let's find out who Karl Marx really was. He was primarily a scholar of capitalism. His monumental work, Das Kapital, is considered probably the best analysis of capitalist economy to date. He claimed that so far capitalism was the best economic system which had created more progress in just one century than humanity had in thousands of years of all previous history. Marx talked about the concept of surplus value as the basis of capitalism. Here's how it works. The means of production, such as tools, facilities, factory buildings, equipment, raw materials, technology, etc., are owned by a rich person. He called them bourgeoisie. These bourgeoisies hire workers, which he called proletariat, and let them use the means of production to create a product. When they sell the product, they pay their workers a salary, which is but a fraction of what the product sold for. The profits that the bourgeoisie get to keep are called surplus value. So now, let's say you hire a company to re-roof your house. They charge you $50 per hour, but pay their workers only $20 per hour, while keeping $20 for themselves and putting $10 towards insurance, materials, and tools. We could argue that this is somewhat fair. However, in early capitalism, the wild capitalism, which Upton Sinclair called the jungle, this arrangement was not fair at all. It was very similar to modern-day outsourcing, where an American company pays a worker in Asia 15 cents an hour. In 1 hour, that worker must make 10 t-shirts, which the company then sells for $40 each. So the worker who made the t-shirt gets 1 penny, and the company owner gets $39.99, or 4,000 times more than the worker who made the product in the first place. That's where Karl Marx became really upset with capitalism after seeing the deplorable working and living conditions of the proletariat, while the factory owners were getting shamelessly rich. This creates a conflict between the owners and the workers, because the owners want to get away with paying as little as possible to maximize their profits, and workers naturally demand a living wage. So basically we have a dominant group, bourgeoisie, who want to take away all the valuable resources from a subordinate group, proletariat. The solution Karl Marx proposed was to get rid of those few rich owners and let the workers collectively own the means of production. It's called socialism. Here's a quick comparison between the two. Capitalism is a type of economic system based on private ownership of the means of production. Socialism is based on collective ownership of the means of production. The goal of capitalism is to maximize individual profits, while the goal of socialism is to satisfy public need. Does socialism work? Well, decide for yourself.
I don't know much about politics. All I know is that we just need a good hard rain to wash the scum off the streets. I've been at UNICAP for 21 years, and I wouldn't have stayed around this long if it weren't for our structure. We have an institutionalized system of seniority pay increases. So you get an extra percentage point every 2,500 hours that you work. So 21 years in, I'm making 50% commission. That's unheard of in this industry. And we have people making even more than that.
I have a PhD without the dissertation in anthropology, so I love observing people's behavior. The first 10 minutes I was in a cab, I thought, what have I been doing wasting my life not driving a cab? A workers' cooperative means the workers own the means of production. At UnionCap, we collectively share the risk, the economic risk. I work weekend nights, and I can expect to make between $18 and $26 an hour. The part of the meter that is not commission goes back to the co-op to pay for salaries of office workers, as well as for reinvesting in the company. We take the long-term view. We are the most successful cab company in the city of Madison. We do really, really well. And part of it may be that we aren't working to pay the CEO a six-figure salary. Our mission is to create jobs at a living wage. We are all one. I mean, our name, Union Cab, I think is beautifully evocative of how we are as a company. So we have Republicans, we have Democrats, we have socialists, we have anarchists, we have, I don't think we have any communists. And the thing we all agree on is our mission and our values. Can hold any political beliefs and still agree on that. You know, unlike some employee-owned companies, this is actual radical workplace democracy where everyone not only owns one share of the business, but also has a say in how the place is run.
This is not unique. We've always had plenty of small businesses here in America that are based on collective ownership of the means of production. So let me ask you again, is socialism really a curse word and something we want to completely eliminate? We don't want any socialism here in America? Well, instead of going to WITC, ranked number 6 in the nation by the way, which is a publicly owned non-profit college, would you rather transfer to some private online diploma mill type university that charges you $20,000 a semester? Should our elderly veterans, people with disabilities, and single mothers with young children be left without any public assistance? The US has arguably the best military in the world. Should it be eliminated? Do we want more parking lots and shopping malls in place of our national parks? Who wants to use toll roads instead of public highways? Should secondary education be only available to those who can pay for it? Don't we want to maintain leadership in space exploration programs? Don't we want our postal services, our public television and radio, the last remaining sources of real information in this country as opposed to corporate media, brain cell killing junk. Our Olympic team, currently the best in the world, and our consumer protection agencies. Last but not least, who are the best football team in the NFL? That's right, the Green Bay Packers. They are one of the oldest franchises and have won more league championships than any other team. And guess what? Packers are the only non-profit, community-owned, major league professional sports team in the United States. They are a socialistic football team, and yet they are the best. Does this mean that socialism is better than capitalism? Is bacon better than eggs? Is peanut butter better than jelly? It appears that both are necessary. Finding a good balance between these two opposites is key. Historically, those countries that succeeded in finding such a balance have enjoyed the highest standard of living in the world. Swedish socialism is a good example of this. Countries that separate capitalism and socialism and take them to an extreme inevitably suffer. Socialism without capitalism becomes stagnant and self-destructs. Individual profit is a great motivator, and competition leads to improved quality and progress. On the other hand, capitalism without regulation and without any regard for public good also dies out. Monopolies emerge, they destroy all the competition, they control the economy and the government, and can unilaterally increase the price of the product while the quality goes down. As a matter of fact, the popular game Monopoly was invented to show how laissez-faire capitalism eventually fails. Now that we've clarified what socialism means, what about communism? Would you like to live in a communist country? I'd love to, but there's a problem. So what is communism, and which industrialized nations achieved communism? Are you thinking China, Cuba, the Soviet Union, North Korea, and the like? Let's look at the definition of communism. Communism, from Latin communis, shared or belong to all, is the idea of a free society where everybody is equal, everything is collectively owned, and everyone's needs are satisfied, where there are no social classes, no money, and no government. So, do those countries meet these criteria? Absolutely not, especially the last one, where there is no government. It's also easy to see now why Western governments and the rich hate Marxism. So the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, North Korea are not examples of communist nations. What is this Communist Party then? Typically, it's a group of dictators who use communism as an excuse to justify their rule. They promise that they are working on achieving communism. They kept promising that in the Soviet Union for over 70 years. Basically, we can say that these communist parties are to communism what KKK is to Christianity. So the question remains, has any industrialized nation achieved communism? No, it has never been achieved and never will be. It's just a nice dream. It does work for small communities of people. The Amish or Native American tribes are good examples of communism. Indeed, if you read the definition of communism again, you'll see that the Amish meet every single criterion. They are a free society, everybody is equal, everything is collectively owned, everyone's needs are satisfied, they have no social classes, they don't use money, and they have no government. But communism requires high levels of personal responsibility and self-discipline. which is not possible in a modern industrialized society, a society that is largely impersonal. People simply don't care about others in a large society like this. You can do a classic study. Go to a Walmart parking lot and observe how many people return their shopping carts to the corral. Not that many, huh? They load the trunks of their cars and drive away, leaving the shopping cart in the middle of the parking lot. All they need to do is walk 5 yards to return the cart, which takes 30 seconds. They know that the cart they leave behind will obstruct the traffic and damage someone else's vehicle, but they don't care. Why should they? They don't know those other people personally. That's why I said I'd love to live in a communist society, but I know it's not possible. Unless one day I am so tired of the constant stress of modern life that I decide to join the Amish. There's one last thing we need to know about Karl Marx as a sociologist. He strongly believed in economic determinism. According to this theory, our social actions are determined by basic economic needs. He postulated that a society consists of the base and superstructure. The base is our economic system, and the superstructure is everything else. Our culture, political institutions, family institutions, art, education, religion, and so forth. The base determines the superstructure. Before a politician, an artist, or an athlete goes to work, they need to eat, drink, and put some clothes on. This makes sense when you try to explain why Ukrainians or New Yorkers are so rude. They ignore the rules of formal politeness because they are preoccupied with satisfying their economic needs. In my opinion, this relationship between the base and superstructure can be reciprocal too. I could argue that Ukrainians experience economic problems because their culture is low, because they are being rude and inconsiderate all the time. This brings us to the next founding father of sociology, Émile Durkheim. This French scholar was concerned about traditional solidarity ties disappearing in industrialized societies. Again, instead of those close-knit communities people were used to, they were now finding themselves feeling disconnected from everybody else. He expounded several important theories based on this idea of solidarity, such as the division of labor changing from mechanical solidarity, a traditional society where everyone performs the same functions, to organic solidarity, our modern society where everyone has narrow specialization, and his famous theory of suicide. Apparently, he observed an increased rate of suicide in this new era of industrialization, and for the first time, related the cause of suicide to the changing conditions in society. This was a whole new interpretation, because typically suicide was considered as something psychological and deeply personal, not a form of collective behavior. But this approach makes perfect sense. Take a look at the list of countries by suicide rates. It's clear that this wide variation has to be caused by very different conditions in those societies. Notice how those countries that have recently undergone major changes in their economic and political institutions seem to have the highest suicide rates. Post-Soviet republics and Asian countries that are now experiencing the same transition Western countries experienced in the 19th century are at the top of the list. The United States is somewhere in the middle, a little closer to the top. Our rate is about 12 suicides per 100,000 people. Is it a high number or a low number? Well, consider that the homicide rate in the United States is about 5 murders per 100,000 people. In other words, Americans are 2 to 3 times more likely to kill themselves than to be killed by others. I think it is high. This forces us as sociologists to analyze what it is in our society that leads people to such high suicide rates. Also notice that males have dramatically higher suicide rates than females. Men in America commit suicide 5 times as often as women. Why do you think this is? So, Emil Durkheim classified suicides by low and high levels of integration and regulation. If people have low level of integration in society, it may lead to egoistic suicide. Collective bonds are weak, and people feel isolated from the rest of society. This is exactly the type of suicide Emil Durkheim observed in newly industrialized societies, and what we just saw in post-Soviet and Asian countries. If the level of regulation is too low, this may lead to anomic suicide. Try to remember this term social anomie, introduced by Emil Durkheim. It means normative vacuum, a state of erosion or absence of social norms and values. This would also be typical in countries that undergo major changes, as people's expectations and their reality become drastically different. Also think about what we teach our children. We tell them that this is a great country, the land of opportunities, that they can become whoever they want to be, and that the sky is their limit. Apparently, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's good to instill confidence in young people. On the other, their expectations may be unrealistic. Consider that in the United States about 90% of high school graduates expect to get white-collar, managerial-type jobs. Of course, there is not enough of such jobs. Next, if the level of integration is too high, this may lead to altruistic suicide. People are attached to a group so strongly that they don't even have their own identity and would be happy to sacrifice their lives for that group. Typically, these are our heroes who die for their country. Suicide bombers who commit terrorist attacks also commit altruistic suicide, and in the eyes of those who share their ideology, they are heroes and saints. Next, we have fatalistic suicide when the level of regulation is too high. This happens when people are constantly being oppressed, abused, discriminated against, humiliated, and all the opportunities are taken away from them. This type of suicide will be common among minority groups. However, we need to consider other variables here as well. Many times, the oppressed minority groups have a strong sense of solidarity, which in turn lessens the chance of suicide. But recent immigrants who experience the same level of oppression and lack that kind of solidarity would be really prone to fatalistic suicide. The last founding father of sociology that we study today is German scholar Max Weber. He made a major contribution to organizational sociology by describing modern bureaucracies. We'll study those later in this semester. He explained the rise of capitalism through Protestant ethics, compared and contrasted Eastern and Western societies, and developed some other areas of sociology. Here we'll talk about his theory of social actions, actions people take in response to others. So, whatever you do in society can be classified as traditional, affectional, value-rational, or instrumental social actions. Let's define each of them and use your decision to go to college as an example. Traditional social action is the type of action you take because that's what everybody else does. Your family members do this, your friends do this, your colleagues do this, you see this in movies and on the news. So pretty much without even thinking about it, you follow in everyone else's footsteps. So are you here because everyone in your family has a college degree? Because all your friends go to college? Or because you constantly hear in the media about the importance of college education? For me, the decision to go to college was pretty much a traditional social action. I come from a long line of teachers and researchers who have advanced college degrees, so it wasn't even an option for me not to go to college. Affectional social action takes place when you are guided by your feelings and emotions. It's when you really love or hate something. So, do you love learning? Is this why you are taking classes at WITC? I have a friend who is a perfect example of this type of social action. We graduated together in 2002. I started teaching and he started applying for different grants and scholarships to continue his education. not because he's very fond of academic pursuits. In fact, he only opens his textbooks at the very last moment and always submits his assignments past the deadline, but because he absolutely loves this college atmosphere of fun, partying, meeting new people, traveling, camping, organizing something, and so forth, instead of having some dull job responsibilities. So first he moved to the United States, where he obtained the exact same degree he'd already earned in Ukraine. Then he got a scholarship to study in a postgraduate program in England and was supposed to be finished by 2007. Somehow he managed to use his charming personality to trick them into constantly giving him extensions and new scholarships until he finally graduated in 2011, 4 years past the deadline. And what did he do with his scholarships, which were supposed to cover his room and board and textbook expenses? He used the money for traveling all over the world, while illegally sleeping in the basement of his department and making a deal with the custodian to bring him any food leftovers from university events so he would never have to spend any money on groceries. Quite resourceful, isn't it? Next, there are different postgraduate research fellowships that allow you to remain a student for the rest of your life. So, like I said, this is a perfect example of affectional social action. Value-rational social action means that you have a valued goal and you choose the most rational means of achieving that goal. Max Weber maintained that all modern bureaucracies are based on value-rational action. Let's say their valued goal is turning in large profits, and so they will choose the most rational, or at least they think they're rational, and efficient ways to reduce their manufacturing costs and expand their markets. As it pertains to education, you could have a valued goal of finding a better job, and the rational way of doing it is going to school and earning the degree you need for that job, as opposed to perhaps trying to bribe the boss. I believe most of you are here because you are taking this value-rational social action. And finally, we have the instrumental social action. This is a little tricky to explain. Here you would be doing something not because of its direct effect, but because of its side effects. What does it mean? Suppose you go to college not because you're interested in learning or earning a degree, but because your parents promised to buy you a new car, or you're fishing for a spouse. And that's actually not that uncommon. In the past, a lot of times women went to college only to earn their MRS. And I should also give you another example how I personally had additional motivation to continue my higher education. In Ukraine, there is still a military draft for all males. And while I wouldn't mind serving in the US military, in Ukraine, it's 2 years of degradation and wasted time. Luckily, you have some excuses to avoid military draft in Ukraine, and one of them is going to college. So that's what I kept doing. They never got me. And the last part of this lecture, History of Sociology, Major Theoretical Perspectives. Here we'll try to master the 3 major theoretical perspectives of modern sociology: the functionalist perspective, the conflict perspective, and the symbolic interactionist perspective. It's very important to understand them because they'll be used over and over again throughout the entire course. We'll do some exercises in class to apply these theories. Please note that sociology is not limited just to 3 theories, of course. There are many other theories, such as social constructionism, feminism, social exchange, phenomenology and ethnomethodology, sociobiology, postmodernism, social Darwinism, and some others. We'll briefly mention them in this course, but most of the time we'll be focusing on those 3. The reason they are most commonly used in Introduction to Sociology is because they are quite comprehensive and provide completely different, and sometimes even opposite, views on society. No theory can completely explain everything, so using all 3 will help us study society from different angles. First is the functionalist perspective, which gives us a rather positive and optimistic view of society. It defines society as a system of interrelated and interdependent parts. Each part, in a certain way, contributes to the overall order and stability. Functionalist perspective has its roots in the 19th century organicism, when everyone was thoroughly impressed with Darwin's theory of evolution. So functionalists, such as British sociologist Herbert Spencer, for example, basically considered society a highly evolved organism and would compare different social institutions to body parts, literally. So the government would be the brain or the central nervous system. The military would be the immune system. Highways, railroads, and other forms of transportation and communication would be the circulatory system. The industry would be the skeletal-muscular system, and so forth. Now, these analogies are interesting and helpful in understanding how societies operate. There are some problems with this theory. An actual organism is in a state of homeostasis, where all organs work together so everything is stable. In a society, is everything stable and harmonious? Do different parts of society always cooperate? No. Furthermore, in every society there are protests, wars, revolutions, and coups d'etat. So you go to bed in the evening, a coup d'etat happens overnight, and in the morning you wake up only to find out that the headquarters of your skull are now occupied and governed by your liver instead of your brain. So, in short, functionalism can't really explain why social problems happen in our society. They try to address this criticism in a way that is similar to when you fall off your chair and then claim that you meant to do that. They would say that all those social problems are not really problems at all, but rather functions. So poverty and crime, for example, still contribute to the overall order and stability in society. Let's see. Poor people will take jobs that nobody else wants. Because of poor people, social workers and police officers have their jobs. Poor people will buy used products that would otherwise have to be thrown away. And poor people will agree to participate in medical experiments so we can test new drugs and treatments on them. Apparently testing drugs on animals is inhumane, but testing them on poor people is just fine. So that's why poverty is a very good thing for society in general. Crime is good too, because we learn by example what is right and what is wrong. So serial killers are really educators and role models. And when some terrible crime happens, people tend to become more united. After the terrorist attacks on 9/11, Americans were more united as a nation. Such explanations only lead to further criticism. Functionalism is a teleological theory. This means that they explain the cause of a certain phenomenon through its effects. They say that poverty exists because someone has to buy used goods. It doesn't really make sense. It rained yesterday because my lawn needed watering. It snowed last spring because I wanted to use my snowmobile. See how it's nonsensical? Finally, if everything is perfect, why do societies even change? American sociologist Robert Merton was able to successfully answer some of this criticism by introducing the concept of dysfunction. So most of the time, everything is functional in society. Every part contributes to the overall order and stability. But sometimes dysfunctions happen. There are two types of functions and dysfunctions: manifest, the ones we expect, and latent, those that we didn't expect. For instance, let's analyze the border industrialization program, where American companies build their plants, or maquiladoras, along the US-Mexico border. The manifest function of this program was to increase revenue for corporations, to bring jobs to Mexico, and to make goods more affordable for the American consumer. The manifest dysfunction of this program was job displacement in the United States. Well, if you ship jobs to Mexico, you lose jobs in the United States. Now, it's a little harder with latent functions and dysfunctions, because those are unexpected consequences. What could be a latent function of this program? It has to be some positive outcome that wasn't expected. Well, we could argue that there is more cultural and economic exchange between the two countries. Americans got introduced to Mexican culture and cuisine. What could be a latent dysfunction here? Some negative outcome that wasn't expected. A big increase in illegal immigration wasn't expected. Although when you place hundreds of thousands of workers on the border and pay them $20 a week, I don't see how it was unexpected. Next is the conflict perspective. This perspective is completely opposite. If functionalism tries to give us a positive view of society, conflict theories portray society as a constant arena of struggle between the dominant and subordinate groups. They do, however, state that conflict is the agent of social change and the source of progress. Conflicts get resolved and we as a society move on. For example, we no longer have slavery, indentured servitude, or institutional racism and sexism. Because we already talked about Karl Marx quite extensively, you are familiar with this terminology: bourgeoisie, means of production, and proletariat. What is facade of legitimacy? It's very similar to rationalization in psychology, one of the ego defense mechanisms that Sigmund Freud described. We feel that what we are doing is not right, but we'll come up with some excuse to present our actions in a more favorable light. We do this to feel better about ourselves and to appease or fool the general public. Suppose you hire an undocumented migrant worker from Mexico as a nanny or a farm worker and pay them way below minimum wage. Clearly, you take advantage of them, but rather than saying, "Yes, I'm such a bad person exploiting a fellow human being, I'll probably burn in hell," you will have some form of excuse. Well, in Mexico, they would have gotten paid even less, and they came here seeking employment, and they agreed to my terms, so really I'm doing them a favor. It's also how market economy works. Another example: when the British Empire was constantly invading other nations and establishing their colonies all over the world, what did Queen Victoria have to say about all this? She would say that they were simply bringing civilization to those poor savages. Sounds familiar? Isn't it ironic that today's United States, a former British colony, uses the same excuse for its own military interventions? We're just spreading democracy around the world. Similarly, when American companies outsource jobs to China, India, Mexico, and other low-wage countries, will they admit that all they care about is their profit margin, or will they pretend to be philanthropists? We just want to bring jobs to those countries and help their struggling economies. We want to offer high-quality products to the American consumer at an affordable price. We care about customers, etc., etc. So these are all examples of facade of legitimacy. Even though such explanations do have some validity, conflict theorists consider this injustice and point out that the real cause here is greed and the desire to dominate and exploit others. So this is where we can criticize the conflict perspective. Although there is plenty of conflict and injustice in our society. Take a look at this newspaper headline. It's not like everyone is constantly trying to take advantage of you and benefit at your expense. We do have cooperation, helping behavior, kindness, compassion, philanthropy, and non-profit organizations in our society. And now, the symbolic interactionist perspective. It defines society as a web of social interactions through which people make sense of the world, experience and define what they and others are doing, and influence and are influenced by others. It may sound a little confusing, but once you understand this perspective, it will probably become your favorite, because it's the closest to psychology and has an entertaining component to it. This is also where the criticism of this perspective comes from. It focuses on individual interactions too much and ignores larger structures in our society. So, to better understand what this theory is about, let's do a little activity. Symbolic interactionism is about how people communicate through symbols, how they create those symbols, and how they interpret those symbols. Anything could be a symbol. A physical object, an Abercrombie and Fitch shirt, is a status symbol among teenagers. An action, buying flowers for a woman, is a symbol for romance. Or a gesture, Aaron Rodgers' bell dance, which is a symbol for touchdown celebration. So next, I'm going to show you some images and you'll try to interpret them. This will give you an insight into how we create and use symbols. Ready? What is the meaning of this? And what is he trying to say? Can you detect any symbolism in here? I like gold, I'm wealthy, I'm feminine, I'm a jewelry salesperson. It's hard to determine what the symbolism here is, if any, isn't it? So I'll just tell you what it is. The guy just purchased a metal detector and is showing off what he was able to find with it. Okay, what about the next image? You can instantly recognize that this is a symbol for engagement. But why? Isn't this pretty much the same picture as before? Someone's hand with rings? So this is what fascinates symbolic interactionism theorists. How such tiny details can tell us so much. What if you wear your engagement ring on your right hand instead of your left? Do you know what it means? In the US, same-sex couples do this. This symbol is not as universal, so not every American will be able to interpret it correctly, let alone people from other countries. In Ukraine, if you wear your ring on your left hand, that means you are of Catholic persuasion. If you wear it on your right, that means that you belong to the Orthodox denomination. 95% of believers in Ukraine are Orthodox Christians, which would sort of require me to wear my wedding ring on my right hand. But because I happen to belong to those 5% of Greek Catholics in Ukraine, everything worked out for me in this country. I wear it on my left hand. Next picture. Who's this? Again, instantly you can identify him as a pirate. How did you do this? A piece of cloth over his eye, a piece of cloth on his head, and the earring do the trick. Now let's rearrange these objects and see what happens in the next picture. Who's this? Big gay Al from South Park. What did the cartoon creators do to make him look gay, though? In this picture we also have an earring, but now it's in his right ear instead of left. And he has a piece of cloth on his neck as opposed to wearing it on his head as a bandana. Seemingly small details that make a big difference. In the next picture, we have a cute girl sticking out of the car window. What is she trying to say? Hurry up, Mummy, I want to go to my slumber party. Actually, we'll never know because there are no universally recognizable symbols here. How about next picture? Here, a gentleman is opening and holding the door for the lady, and is letting her go first. That's just what gentlemen do, and we interpret this as good manners. Are there any other interpretations? Where did this tradition come from? Are men just trying to serve their beloved women, or... Guess how radical feminists interpret these courtship manners. You are the inferior, weak, and helpless woman, and I am the strong, dominant, and controlling man, so I'm gonna open the door for you. So much for trying to be nice, right? But this is a really good question to think about what our manners mean and how they originated. Next, when you look at this gentleman, what impression do you get? What is he communicating through his clothes? He means business, right? He is serious, he is experienced, he is skilled, he has good work ethics, and he wants to do something important that also pays well. And what about this gentleman? He takes it easy, His attitude is laid back rather than serious. Life is too important to be taken seriously, right? He rebels against cultural norms of our society, and he probably likes a certain kind of music. And this is a great attitude to have, but remember, don't dress like this for your job interview. And the last picture. What's this? Do you recognize these buildings? It's the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, targeted in terrorist attacks on 9/11. Why do you suppose they chose these buildings as opposed to, say, the Yankee Stadium with over 50,000 people in it? Apparently, they picked their targets because of their strong symbolic meaning. The World Trade Center represented the U.S. economic power, and the Pentagon represented the United States military power. So let's summarize these three perspectives. The functionalist perspective always asks the question, how does a part contribute to overall stability? The conflict perspective asks the question, who benefits from a particular arrangement and in whose expense? The symbolic interactionist perspective asks the question, what meanings do people attach to actions and objects? We'll be practicing these three theories during the course of the semester. Last but not least, I'd like to show you the internal structure of sociology as a science, all the layers, nuts and bolts it consists of. So, for dessert, let's picture sociology as a cake, a three-tier cake to be specific. There are three levels of sociology. Originally, it began with social philosophers who were interested in fundamental questions about our society, acquiring and transmitting culture, solidarity ties, the process of socialization, development of self, social stratification, etc. Then there were those who were doing applied research, surveying people about their political views, living conditions, conducting social experiments and observations to study practical issues. At first there was a huge gap between these two groups. They didn't see how what they were doing was related at all. In fact, even today, some theoretical sociologists who continue studying fundamental questions scoff at social workers who call themselves applied sociologists. So, how did they bridge the gap between general theories and applied research? Again, it's thanks to the American sociologist Robert Merton, who introduced the idea of middle range or special sociological theories. Now, those social philosophers could be a little more specific in their studies and talk about different social institutions, social associations, and social processes rather than talking about society in general. And those applied researchers could make some general conclusions after processing their findings. We begin this course by studying fundamental theories. Then in later chapters we study some of the middle range theories, such as sociology of groups and organizations, social class, family, deviance, politics, religion, and education. And as we go, I'll be assigning some applied research projects for extra credit.